Our power in the UN is a power of persuasion, is a power of speaking up, is a power of denouncing what needs to be denounced, but we cannot order countries to do what they must do.
The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is no stranger to chaos.
Very good morning.
Good morning, sir.
He's presided over the UN during one of the most volatile periods in recent history. A climate crisis that's already forcing mass migrations, a pandemic that has killed millions, and multiple wars with no end in sight.
I now invite the Secretary-General of the United Nations to address the Commission.
We caught up with Guterres at the UN headquarters in New York about the world's most pressing issues and where the UN has fallen short.
You've talked about your generation having failed the world when it comes to climate change. What do you think has been the UN failure on this issue? Would you say that the organization itself bears some responsibility for where we're at?
The problem of the UN is that our multilateralism has no teeth. The UN has no power. We totally depend on the consensus of member states. So we put pressure. We ask governments to take measures. We bring governments together to act. We act with industry. But it all depends on the will of governments, and especially on the will of the most powerful governments in the world.
Do you think the UN could have done more?
The G20, the largest economies in the world, they represent about 80% of emissions. We need the G20, all of them, to commit to carbon neutrality, and all of them to commit to the measures that really are necessary. Our power in the UN is a power of persuasion, is a power of speaking up, denouncing what needs to be denounced, but we cannot order countries to do what they must do.
You said the current system is weighted towards destruction. What did you mean by that?
Look at what's happening with storms, with hurricanes, the rising sea level, glaciers melting, the ice cap in the Arctic risking to disappear, with biodiversity being lost. 1 million species are at risk of disappearing. We see that the world we knew will change dramatically and will destroy life. And in the end, it's our life that will be destroyed. There is one thing that is a paradox. When you destroy a forest, you are creating GDP according to the statistics. When you overfish, you are increasing your GDP according to the statistics. When you destroy the planet, you are, in the statistics, you are showing an increase of GDP. So even that needs to be changed. We need to have a new way to measure our economy, to measure our activity, to make sure that we take into account the dramatic cost that we all face by the destruction of nature.
You've talked about the rising threat of white supremacy extremist groups. You've said that some of these groups have been cheered on by people in positions of responsibility in ways that were considered unimaginable not long ago. Are you talking about former President Donald Trump? Would you include him in that?
Let's first look at the problem, because it's easy to blame one person. I think the problem is much more general. At a certain moment, I felt we were moving into a post-Enlightenment world with irrationality expressed in nationalisms, in populisms, in extremisms of different sorts, and in racism, xenophobia, and really white supremacy and neo-Nazis. I mean, if there is something irrational in the world, is that.
When do you think that started?
I think it has been piling up in the last few years in a more dramatic way, but we have seen it everywhere. We have seen it in Europe. Remember the campaigns against migration, against the refugees in the European continent. We have seen it in the United States. We have seen it in other parts of the world. Racism is the denial of all human values. And this idea of white supremacy is an absolutely horrible thing that we need to fight.
Do you think former President Trump has any responsibility in that?
I don't think he was feeling these things, but of course
there is an environment. Do you think he contributed to the problem?
I think that there is an environment in which it is very important to fight it clearly, and that fight was absent to a certain extent in recent times.
The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots.
Former President Trump described the UN as utterly weak and incompetent. What's it been like to have a president of the United States who speaks in those terms about this institution?
Well, when you have a situation like this and you need to preserve the UN, you need to control the damage and to seize the opportunities of cooperation. And there were areas of cooperation with the American administration. We were working together in Yemen to push for peace. We were working together in Libya to push for peace. So there are areas of cooperation, and you need to control the damage.
What kind of damage is done with that?
It was very important to avoid a breakout in the relations between the United States and the United Nations. And one of my objectives was to avoid that, to make sure that the US would remain in the UN and that independently of the many things that were happening, that of course were negative from our perspective, we would not have a total separation, a total confrontation that would be a disaster for the world.
Major developments in the killing of US-based journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
The Director of National Intelligence has released a report
with new details about those responsible.
The declassified report says the prince approved a plan to either capture or kill Khashoggi, who had criticized the Saudi regime.
Saudi Arabia, do you have any doubt that MBS was responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, this is something that I believe needs to be established by the courts or needs to be established by a serious investigation. And we have been appealing for a serious, honest international investigation to take place.
Okay. And the recent report released by the US, the intelligence report?
Well, there are many reports, but what we need is a serious, impartial international investigation with independence to clearly establish the truth.
And if that was established, what kind of sanctions do you think would be appropriate?
Well, I mean, it depends on what the report establishes, but of course there is a principle of accountability that those that commit a crime should be punished. But that's the general principle. But as I said, we need to establish the truth. That is the starting point without which everything will be precarious.
It's been 10 years since the start of the Syrian conflict. When you look back on this period, is that the biggest regret that you have about the UN's?
It's an horrible failure of the international community as a whole. I mean, I know the Syrian people quite well. When I was High Commissioner for Refugees, Syria has received almost 2 million refugees from Iraq. And the generosity of the Syrian people was amazing. Now, to see these generous people suffering so much, with so many killed, so many cities destroyed, people tortured, I mean, women raped. To see all this suffering of the Syrian people during 10 years and to feel that we were not able to stop it was indeed something terrible. It's true that now we have a ceasefire that is more or less holding. It's true that now there is, some movement with the Geneva talks, but let's be clear, we are far from having a solution, and the economy is devastated, and the country is with dramatic humanitarian needs, and people are suffering in a way that really breaks my heart. And to be frank, I mean, to be here in the UN, we are in the room of the Security Council, and to see that the Security Council was not able to stop this war, it's heartbreaking.
You've talked about this being one of the greatest moral tests of our time, the inequality of vaccine access around the world. Why do you see this as such an important issue?
Well, it's a moral test we are failing. We see massive vaccination here, where we are in the United States. We see the developed world in general with high levels of vaccination and very few doses available for developing countries. So if we don't cut the spread of the virus quickly, if we don't avoid the virus spreading like wildfire in the global south, those that are vaccinated in the global north might next year see their vaccines no longer valid because the virus has mutated in the south.
You mentioned the US, the availability of the vaccine here. Some people have criticized the Biden administration for hoarding. There's tens of millions of doses of vaccines stored in warehouses here that aren't even approved for use in the United States. Do you agree with those that say that there should be a different approach from this administration?
I think that governments have the right and the obligation to protect their own peoples, but they cannot protect their own peoples alone. I've been very strongly saying avoid vaccine nationalism and share what you have, take care of your people, but don't forget all the others that unfortunately for the moment are being forgotten.